A beggar girl saved a billionaire's life. But what he did in return left her speechless. The wind howled through the streets of New York, carrying the scent of rain and damp asphalt. The city never slept, but for Ava Monroe, sleep was a luxury she could barely afford. At just 19, she had spent more nights under flickering streetlights than she cared to count. Her world consisted of cold pavement, discarded newspapers for warmth, and the ever-present hunger gnawing at her stomach. Tonight was no different. She pulled her thin jacket tighter around her, her fingers numb from the chill in the air. She had found a half-eaten sandwich near a deli earlier, but she had given most of it to an old man curled up in an alleyway. He had thanked her with tired eyes, the kind that had seen too much. Ava had merely smiled before walking away, ignoring the hunger pangs in her own stomach. She wasn't a saint. She wasn't trying to be. She just knew what it was like to be forgotten. As she made her way to her usual sleeping spot, a hidden corner behind an abandoned bookstore, she paused near a storefront, her gaze lifting toward the glowing skyline. The towering glass buildings reflected the city lights, glittering like stars trapped on Earth. Somewhere up there, people lived in unimaginable wealth, untouched by the struggles she faced every day. She wondered what it felt like to sleep in a warm bed, to wake up without fear gnawing at the edges of her mind. But dreams were dangerous. They made the reality of her life feel even harsher. So, she tore her gaze away and walked on. A few blocks away, Damian Cross stepped out of a sleek black car, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. His expression was unreadable, his dark eyes reflecting nothing but cold calculation. The meeting had gone as expected. Another deal closed, another empire absorbed into his ever-growing business. To the world, he was a man who had everything. Power, money, influence. But none of it mattered. It never had. The people around him either feared him or wanted something from him. He had long since stopped believing in trust and loyalty. His wealth had bought him everything except the one thing he had never truly known: genuine human connection. As he walked toward his private elevator, he noticed a shadow moving in the alley beside the building. A flicker of movement, barely noticeable, but his instincts sharpened. And then pain. A sharp, burning sensation tore through his side as a masked figure lunged from the darkness, a blade glinting under the city lights. Damian staggered back, gripping his wound as warm blood seeped through his fingers. Another assailant appeared, landing a brutal strike to his ribs, sending him crashing against the brick wall. His bodyguards, where the hell were they? He fought back, landing a punch that sent one attacker sprawling, but the pain slowed him down. Another hit landed, his vision blurring. He barely registered the words murmured by one of the men before they fled into the night, leaving him crumpled on the pavement. This wasn't a robbery. It was an execution. Ava had seen plenty of crime in the city, muggings, fights, even stabbings, but she had never witnessed a man being left to die. From her spot in the shadows, she saw the sharp contrast of blood against Damian's expensive suit. His breaths were ragged, his body limp. She should walk away. If she got involved, she could be caught up in something far bigger than herself. But her feet refused to move. People passed by on the busy street, their eyes flickering to the scene before quickly looking away. No one wanted to get involved. No one wanted the trouble. But she couldn't leave him. Swallowing her fear, she darted forward, crouching beside him. His eyes flickered open, hazy with pain, barely registering her presence. Blood coated his fingers, staining the pavement beneath him. "Hey," she whispered, shaking his shoulder. "Stay with me." There was no response. Her pulse pounded. If she left him here, he wouldn't make it. She had to move him. But he was heavy, his dead weight almost impossible to lift. "Come on," she muttered, her muscles straining as she dragged him toward a nearby alleyway, away from prying eyes. The abandoned building where she sometimes hid from the cold wasn't far. She had no medical supplies, no real way of helping him, but at least he wouldn't be left out in the open to bleed out on the sidewalk. By the time she got him inside, her breaths were shallow, her arms burning from exertion. She eased him onto the dusty floor, her hands shaking as she unbuttoned his blood-soaked shirt. The wound was deep but not fatal. At least, not if she stopped the bleeding. Ripping a strip of fabric from her own jacket, she pressed it against the wound, applying pressure. Damien groaned, his body tensing beneath her touch. "You're okay," she murmured, even though she wasn't sure if that was true. She had no idea who he was, no idea that she was saving a man worth billions. To her, he was just another person the world had decided wasn't worth saving. And she had spent too long being that person herself. Hours passed, and the night deepened. Damien's breath steadied, though his skin was still pale. Ava stayed close, her body curled up against the cold. She had nowhere else to be, and for some reason, she didn't want to leave him alone. She didn't know that this night would change her life forever, that the man she had saved would soon hold her fate in his hands. All she knew was that for the first time in a long time, she had done something that mattered. Darkness pressed against Damien's mind like a heavy weight, dragging him between the edge of consciousness and oblivion. A dull, throbbing pain radiated from his side, spreading through his limbs like fire. His eyelids felt like lead as he forced them open, blinking against the dim, flickering light above him. The air was thick with the scent of damp concrete and dust, a sharp contrast to the sterile luxury he was used to. His body tensed instinctively. Where was he? He tried to sit up, but a sharp, searing pain shot through his torso, forcing a ragged groan from his lips. His hand flew to his side, where bandages, rough, makeshift ones, pressed tightly against his skin. His breath was uneven, his mind struggling to piece together the events that led him here. The meeting, the alley, the knife, the attack. His pulse spiked as his gaze darted around the unfamiliar space. It was a small, crumbling room, exposed brick, cracked tiles, the faint drip of water echoing in the silence. His entire body screamed in protest as he shifted, his vision still hazy from blood loss. And then he saw her. A girl sat a few feet away, her frame small, wrapped in a tattered jacket that was barely thick enough for the cold. Her dark hair framed a face that, despite the dirt smudged across her cheek, held a strange, quiet strength. She was watching him, her expression unreadable. Damien's muscles coiled. "Who are you?" His voice came out rough, strained. The girl didn't flinch. "Ava." His eyes narrowed. "Where am I?" "A place no one would think to look for you." She gestured vaguely to the walls surrounding them. "Not exactly a five-star hotel, but it was the best I could do." His head spun. He needed answers. "The attack. I saw it," she interrupted. "You were bleeding out in the street. I pulled you out of there before anyone else could finish the job." Her words landed like a punch to the gut. A stranger had saved him? A girl who looked like she barely had enough to survive herself? His gaze flickered to the bandages, the torn pieces of fabric that were clearly not from expensive medical supplies, but from her own clothes. "Why?" His tone was sharp, demanding. Ava raised an eyebrow, as if the answer should have been obvious. "Because you were dying." Damien let out a bitter laugh, though the motion sent a fresh wave of pain through his ribs. "People don't just help others for nothing. What do you want?" Ava sighed, shaking her head. "I don't want anything." He studied her, searching for deception. Everyone had an angle. Everyone wanted something: money, power, favors. Yet, her eyes held none of the greed he was used to seeing. There was something unsettling about her calmness, her complete lack of expectation. Still, he wasn't ready to believe her. "You could have left me there. Called the cops. Sold information about me." She shrugged. "Maybe, but I didn't." Damien exhaled slowly, his distrust still lingering. He had built his empire on understanding human nature, and selfless kindness didn't exist in the world he knew. But he was alive. Because of her. The silence stretched between them. Ava finally pushed a small, dented water bottle toward him. "Drink. You lost a lot of blood." He hesitated before taking it, his fingers brushing against hers briefly. Her skin was cold, her hands rough, a stark contrast to his own carefully maintained life of comfort. He took a slow sip, his throat dry. The water was lukewarm, but right now, it might as well have been a luxury. Ava leaned back against the wall, pulling her knees to her chest. "You should rest. You're not in any shape to move yet." Damien wanted to argue, wanted to regain control of the situation, but exhaustion was already pulling at him again. He closed his eyes, just for a moment. The sound of distant sirens hummed in the background. He wasn't sure if they were real or just echoes in his mind. And for the first time in years, Damien Cross let himself be vulnerable in front of someone who had nothing to gain from him. He didn't know how long he had been out, but when he awoke again, the room was no longer silent. The distant sound of heavy footsteps echoed outside the walls, a rhythmic, purposeful march that sent a jolt of awareness through his body. Ava heard it too. She stiffened, pushing herself up quickly. Damien's instincts flared. He recognized that sound. His security team. A second later, the door burst open. Men in dark suits flooded the space, weapons drawn, eyes scanning the room for threats. Damien barely had time to register their presence before one of them was at his side, checking his wounds, muttering rapid updates into an earpiece. "Sir, we've secured the perimeter." Another voice, cold and sharp, cut through the noise. "We need to move you immediately." Damien barely reacted to them. His eyes were locked on Ava. She had stepped back into the shadows, watching everything unfold with the same quiet intensity as before. This was it, the moment where their worlds snapped apart again. One of the guards turned to her, suspicion lacing his voice. "Who is she?" Ava didn't wait for an answer. She moved, not toward him, not toward them, just away. Without a word, she turned and disappeared into the alley beyond, her footsteps light, almost practiced, as if she had always known she would leave unnoticed. Damien didn't stop her. He didn't know why. Maybe it was because his mind was still spinning from the events of the last few hours. Maybe it was because, deep down, some part of him thought he'd never see her again. Or maybe it was because for the first time in his life, he had no idea how to repay a debt that could never be measured in wealth. His guards escorted him out of the crumbling building, away from the shadows and into the blinding lights of the city that had always belonged to him. The world welcomed him back, but for the first time, it felt different. As the black car pulled away from the alley, Damien's gaze flickered toward the side mirror, catching one last glimpse of the empty street where she had disappeared. And for reasons he couldn't yet understand, that image stayed with him longer than it should have. The city lights stretched endlessly beyond the tinted windows of the black sedan, a blur of neon signs and towering glass buildings. Damien sat in silence, his body aching, his mind restless. His security team spoke in hushed voices around him, updating each other on the situation, but their words barely registered. His fingers tightened around the fabric of his jacket, still damp with blood. The weight of the night clung to him. The cold alley, the scent of damp concrete, the distant hum of sirens. And her, Ava. His jaw clenched as he stared out at the passing streets. He didn't know what unsettled him more, the fact that someone had tried to kill him or the fact that a complete stranger had saved him. The car glided smoothly through the city before coming to a slow stop in front of his penthouse. The towering skyscraper loomed above him, its glass reflecting the city like a distorted dream. The doors opened, and his guards flanked him as he stepped out, their presence a reminder that his world was one of power, control, and relentless survival. But tonight, for the first time in his life, he had been powerless. Inside, the penthouse was exactly as he had left it. Pristine, untouched cold. The walls were lined with art worth millions, the floors polished to perfection, the furniture carefully curated to fit a life of luxury. It was everything he had built, everything he had worked for, and yet it felt hollow. His assistant, a composed woman in her 40s, approached him with a worried expression. "Mr. Cross, the doctors are ready to—" No, his voice was sharp, final. He didn't need doctors. He needed answers. The room was filled with the quiet hum of his security team moving with precision. The head of his security, a broad-shouldered man named Victor, stepped forward. "We've already started looking into the attack," Victor said. "It was calculated. Professional. Whoever ordered this wanted to make sure you didn't leave that alley alive." Damien exhaled slowly, his mind racing. He had enemies, too many to count. Victor hesitated before continuing. "We'll find them. But there's something else." Damien lifted an eyebrow. signaling for him to continue. The girl, Ava. Damien's fingers twitched at the mention of her name. She's gone. Gone. The word settled uneasily in his chest. It shouldn't matter. She was a nameless girl, just another face in the city shadows. She had done what no one else would, saved him without expecting anything in return. And then, just as quickly as she had appeared, she had vanished. Find her. Victor blinked. Sir, find her, Damien repeated, his voice colder this time. I want to know everything. Who she is. Where she is. Victor hesitated. We checked the area after your extraction. There's no sign of her. She doesn't exist in any database. No records. Nothing. If she's been on the streets for a while, she's a ghost. Damien exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. He had built an empire on tracking down information, uncovering secrets people wanted buried. Finding one girl should have been easy. And yet, she had disappeared as if she had never been there at all. A bitter smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. Of course she had. She had nothing. No home. No resources. No safety net. And still, she had saved him. The weight of the unspoken debt settled heavily in his chest. Victor's voice pulled him back. Should we keep looking? Damien didn't hesitate. Yes. Days passed, then weeks, and still no sign of her. Damien sat in his office, his gaze fixed on the city skyline. The glass windows stretched from floor to ceiling, showcasing the world he owned. Deals were being made. Money was flowing. His company thrived. And yet, his thoughts drifted elsewhere. To her. To the moment she had looked at him with nothing but quiet certainty and said, I don't want anything. No one had ever said that to him before. Everyone wanted something. His phone buzzed. Victor's voice came through the speaker. We found her. Damien was on his feet before he even realized it. Where? There was a brief silence. Then Victor spoke, his voice lower this time. You're not going to like it. The alley was darker than he remembered. Damien stepped out of the car, his polished shoes meeting the cracked pavement. The air was thick with the scent of rain and garbage, the kind of place most people would never step foot in. But he had been here before, and so had she. Victor stood a few feet ahead, his expression unreadable. She's there. Damien followed his gaze. Ava was curled up against the wall, her frame even smaller than he remembered. Her arms were wrapped around herself, her breathing shallow. Her clothes were thinner, her hair tangled. The small fire burning in a metal drum nearby cast flickering shadows across her face, illuminating the sharp hollows of her cheeks. She looked worse than before. A wave of something unfamiliar crashed over him. He had expected to find her, maybe struggling but still moving, still fighting. But this was different. She was barely holding on. Damien took a step forward, but she didn't move. Didn't even react. It wasn't until he crouched down beside her that her eyes fluttered open. For a moment, she just stared at him, her gaze unfocused, hazy. Then recognition flickered, and a weak smile tugged at her lips. Guess he didn't die after all, she murmured, her voice hoarse. Damien's throat tightened. You're sick. Ava let out a breathy laugh. Yeah, turns out being broke isn't great for your health. Damien clenched his jaw. The way she spoke, so casual, as if this was just another day, another battle to survive, made something in him twist painfully. You should have come to me. Ava gave him a tired look. Why would I? Because you saved my life. Because you don't deserve this. Because I owe you. He didn't say any of those things. Instead, he did something he never did. He reached out. Ava stiffened as his fingers brushed her arm, but she didn't pull away. Her skin was cold. Too cold. We're leaving. His voice left no room for argument. Ava blinked. What? You're not staying here. A flash of stubbornness flickered across her face, but Damien had already made up his mind. This wasn't about repaying a debt anymore. This was about the fact that for the first time in his life, he had seen kindness. Pure, selfless kindness. And he refused to let it fade away into the streets. Ava Monroe had saved his life. Now it was his turn. The cold night air wrapped around them, the distant hum of the city filling the silence between them. Ava stood weakly, her legs trembling from exhaustion, but her chin lifted in defiance. She had been through too much to let anyone, even a billionaire, decide her fate. Yet, here he was standing before her, offering something that felt impossible. "Come with me," Damien said, his voice even controlled. "You don't belong here." Ava let out a hollow laugh, shaking her head. "And where exactly do I belong? In some penthouse? At your side like some kind of pet you rescued?" His jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being questioned, let alone challenged. "I'm offering you a way out. Food, shelter, whatever you need. No conditions." Ava crossed her arms over her frail body, her breath uneven. "Nothing in life comes for free." Damien's eyes darkened. "You saved my life. Consider this my way of balancing the scales." She scoffed. "That's not how it works. I didn't save you because I wanted something in return. I did it because She stopped herself, exhaling sharply. "Because I'm not like you." Damien saw the hesitation in her eyes, the battle waging inside her. He wasn't one to beg. He didn't negotiate with people who had nothing to offer him. And yet, something about her made him want to push, to break through whatever wall she had built. "You're barely standing," he pointed out. "How long do you think you'll last out here? Another night? Maybe two." Ava clenched her fists, but she didn't have a good answer. She was exhausted, starving, and sick. Every part of her body screamed for rest, for warmth. But taking his offer meant stepping into a world she didn't trust, a world that had never done anything for her. She studied him carefully. His suit was still pristine despite everything he had been through. His posture screamed power, control, a man who had never gone a day without getting exactly what he wanted. "You think you could just fix this?" she asked, her voice quieter now. "That you can throw money at my problems and make them disappear?" Damien didn't flinch. "No, but I can make sure you don't die on a sidewalk." His words cut through her defenses like a knife. Because deep down, she knew he was right. Her pride warred with her survival instincts, but her body made the decision for her. She swayed slightly, her vision blurring at the edges. Damien stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Just take the damn offer, Ava." Her lips pressed into a thin line, her heart hammering. Finally, with a heavy breath, she muttered, "Fine." His expression didn't change, but something in his stance shifted, an almost imperceptible relief. "But don't think for a second I owe you anything," she added sharply. "I'm not part of your world. I never will be." Damien didn't argue. He simply turned toward the waiting car, leaving her with no choice but to follow. The car's interior was silent as they drove through the city. Ava sat stiffly against the leather seat, her fingers gripping the fabric of her worn-out hoodie. The air smelled of something expensive, clean, crisp, unfamiliar. Damien sat across from her, his phone in hand, his expression unreadable. Even in the dim light, his presence was suffocating. He was a man used to control, used to being the most powerful person in the room. She hated it. "You don't have to watch me like I'm going to rob you," she muttered, staring out the window. "I get it. I don't belong here." Damien barely glanced up. "You're in my car, heading to my home. You belong where I say you do." Ava scoffed. "That's cute. You really think money lets you decide everything, don't you?" He set his phone down, fixing her with a cold stare. "It usually does." She let out a dry laugh. "Must be nice." Damien didn't respond. He didn't need to. He had spent his entire life building walls, keeping people at a distance. He didn't trust, and he didn't expect to be trusted. But Ava wasn't like the people in his world. She didn't shrink under his gaze. She challenged him. And, for reasons he couldn't understand, he didn't hate it. The car slowed as they approached a towering glass building. The entrance alone screamed wealth, with gold accents and security guards standing at attention. Ava tensed. Yeah, this is a mistake. Damien didn't even look at her as he stepped out of the car. Too late to back out now. She swallowed hard, reluctantly following him inside. The moment they entered, everything felt wrong. The lobby was massive, lined with sleek marble and dim lighting designed to exude elegance. People in expensive suits passed by, sparing Ava curious and judgmental glances. Her hoodie felt thinner. Her shoes felt dirtier. Damien walked ahead, completely unfazed. This was his world. A woman at the front desk smiled politely. "Mr. Cross, welcome back." Then her gaze flickered to Ava, her expression faltering just slightly before she smoothed it over. "Shall I prepare a guest room?" Ava shifted uncomfortably. Damien's world was built on wealth, on people who whispered behind closed doors, who pretended to be polite while judging everything about you. "Make sure she has everything she needs," Damien instructed before heading toward the private elevator. Ava lingered for a moment before hesitantly following. As the elevator doors closed, she crossed her arms. "Is this the part where you lock me in a tower and never let me leave?" Damien smirked. "You really do have a dramatic imagination." She rolled her eyes. "Just saying, this is starting to feel like the setup for some kind of twisted billionaire kidnapping situation." Damien leaned against the elevator wall, watching her carefully. "If I wanted to keep you locked away, you'd already know it." Ava didn't doubt that for a second. The doors opened to the penthouse, and the sheer size of the space made her stomach tighten. High ceilings, massive windows overlooking the city, and furniture that probably cost more than she'd ever make in a lifetime. She barely stepped inside before muttering, "Yeah, this is definitely a mistake." Damien exhaled sharply. "You keep saying that, yet here you are." Ava turned to him, her eyes burning. "Because I didn't have a choice." The words hung between them, heavy and raw. Damien's gaze flickered, something unreadable passing through his expression. Then, softer this time, he said, "You do now." Ava clenched her jaw, looking away. She didn't believe that. Not yet. But for now, she was too tired to fight. "Where's the food?" she muttered. A small, almost amused smile tugged at Damien's lips. "Finally, something we agree on." Ava sat stiffly at the dining table, staring at the extravagant spread before her. Plates of perfectly seared steak, grilled vegetables, fresh bread, and even a selection of desserts were laid out in a way she had only seen in magazines or through restaurant windows. Her stomach twisted, not with hunger but with unease. This wasn't her world. She had spent years digging through trash cans and taking half-eaten sandwiches when no one was looking. Now, she was sitting in a penthouse across from a billionaire, being offered a meal fit for royalty. It felt wrong. Damien, who had changed into a crisp black shirt and slacks, picked up his knife and fork with the kind of ease that came from a life of luxury. He didn't look at her as he cut into his steak, chewing slowly. It was like she wasn't even there. Ava shifted, gripping the edge of her chair. The silence stretched, suffocating. "You expect me to eat this?" she finally asked, her voice edged with disbelief. Damien didn't look up. "It's food. You're starving. Eat." Her hands curled into fists. "I don't need charity." Damien exhaled through his nose, setting down his silverware. His dark eyes met hers, cool and unreadable. "It's not charity. It's a meal. You saved my life. The least I can do is make sure you don't collapse from hunger." Ava clenched her jaw. He said it like it was a simple transaction, a debt repaid, but she knew better. Nothing in this world was free. Still, her stomach ached, and the scent of freshly cooked food made her dizzy. She hesitated for a long moment before finally reaching for a piece of bread. The warmth seeped into her fingers, and the second she took a bite, her body betrayed her. The hunger took over, and before she knew it, she was devouring the meal, barely stopping to breathe. Damien watched without a word. When she finally slowed, her hunger dulled by the richness of the food, she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. The tension in the room hadn't lifted. She swallowed hard. "So what now? Am I supposed to say thank you and pretend this is normal?" Damien leaned back in his chair, regarding her carefully. "You don't have to say anything. Just eat, rest, and figure out what you want to do next." She narrowed her eyes. "And if what I want is to leave?" His lips pressed into a thin line. "Then you leave." Ava searched his face, trying to find the catch. There had to be one. No one like him just let things go. Just like that. Damien's gaze darkened. "I don't keep people who don't want to be here." Something about the way he said it made her pause. There was an edge beneath his words, something deeper that she couldn't quite place. A loneliness that didn't belong to a man who had everything. She dropped her gaze, suddenly exhausted. "Fine, I'll stay the night. But don't get any ideas. I'm not some charity case you get to fix." Damien didn't react. "I wouldn't dream of it." The guest room was bigger than any place Ava had ever slept in. The bed alone was enormous, covered in thick blankets, softer than anything she had ever touched. There was a private bathroom, a massive closet filled with clothes she would never wear, and a window that overlooked the entire city. She stood near the window, staring at the skyline, her arms wrapped around herself. She should have felt relieved, safe, but all she felt was lost. She didn't belong here. And yet, the thought of going back to the streets, of fighting for every scrap of food, of sleeping with one eye open, it was unbearable. She hated Damien for putting her in this position, for making her realize how much she wanted something better. A knock at the door made her jump. She turned just as Damien stepped inside, his usual cold expression unreadable. "I'll have clothes sent up in the morning," he said. "Until then, there's a robe in the bathroom." Ava crossed her arms. "I don't need." "You do." His voice was firm. "Just take it." She let out a breath, too tired to argue. Damien hesitated for a moment. Then, softer, he said, "Get some rest, Ava." And then he was gone, leaving her alone in a world that still didn't feel real. The morning came too quickly. Ava woke to the scent of coffee and the distant hum of voices. For a brief moment, she forgot where she was. Then reality crashed in. She wasn't curled up under an old blanket in an alley. She was in a billionaire's penthouse, and she had no idea what came next. She dragged herself out of bed, finding a robe exactly where Damien said it would be. The fabric was thick, expensive, and completely foreign to her. But she slipped it on anyway before stepping out of the room. The penthouse was quiet, but not empty. She found Damien in the living area, a phone to his ear, his brows furrowed as he spoke in low, clipped tones. He was dressed in another perfectly tailored suit, looking every bit the untouchable businessman he was. He didn't acknowledge her at first. His focus locked on whoever was on the other end of the call. But as she moved closer, his sharp gaze flicked to her, taking in her appearance with a quick glance. Something about the way he looked at her made her self-conscious, and she hated it. He ended the call, setting his phone down. "Sleep well." Ava shrugged. "Better than the sidewalk." A ghost of a smirk tugged at his lips. "That's a start." She sighed, rubbing her temples. "Okay, so what's the plan? You're obviously busy running whatever empire you own. Am I just supposed to sit here all day and pretend I belong?" Damien leaned back against the couch, studying her. "You do whatever you want. Stay. Leave. It's up to you." Ava frowned. "You really don't care, do you?" His expression hardened. "If I didn't care, I wouldn't have brought you here." Her chest tightened at that, but she pushed it aside. "And what about your people? Your staff? They're all probably wondering who the hell I am." Damien exhaled sharply. "They'll get over it." Ava scoffed. "Yeah, somehow I doubt that." The truth was, she had seen the way they looked at her. The whispers, the barely concealed judgment. She was an intruder in their world, a stray they assumed Damien would eventually toss back onto the streets. And maybe they were right. A tense silence settled between them. Then, unexpectedly, Damien said, "I have a meeting. Stay as long as you need. No one will bother you." And just like that, he was gone, leaving Ava standing in the middle of his world, unsure of what to do with herself. Hours passed. Ava wandered the penthouse, ignoring the judgmental stares from Damien's staff. She explored the rooms, the massive kitchen, the private study filled with books she would never read. Everything felt too big, too quiet. She hated it. By the time Damien returned that evening, she had made up her mind. "I'm leaving," she announced the second he stepped inside. He didn't look surprised. "Are you?" he asked calmly, setting down his briefcase. Ava crossed her arms. "Yeah, this isn't me. I don't belong here." Damien studied her for a long moment. Then he simply said, "All right." She blinked, caught off guard. "That's it." He nodded. "That's it." She stared at him, waiting for a catch. Some condition, some demand. But there was nothing, just quiet acceptance. And for some reason, that made it harder to leave. Ava stood frozen, staring at Damien, waiting for him to give her a reason to stay. A reason to run. Something. Anything. But he just stood there, calm and unaffected, like her decision didn't matter. And maybe it didn't. Maybe she was just another passing moment in his life. Someone he had helped, nothing more. A bitter feeling curled in her stomach. She forced herself to turn away, to move toward the door. "Fine," she muttered. "I'll be out of your way soon enough." Damien said nothing. As she walked back to the guest room, her pulse hammered in her ears. She grabbed the clothes that had been delivered, simple jeans, a plain shirt, sneakers, and changed quickly. They fit well, too well, and the realization unsettled her. She didn't belong in them. She didn't belong in this life. And yet, when she stepped back into the living area, ready to leave, something made her hesitate. Damien was no longer standing there. He had moved to the window, his back to her, staring out over the city as if lost in thought. For a moment, she considered walking away without another word, just disappearing like she had never been here at all. But she couldn't. "Why did you help me?" she asked suddenly, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Damien didn't turn around. "You saved my life," he said simply. Ava shook her head. "That's not it. You could have sent someone to find me, thrown some money at me, and called it a day. Instead, you brought me here." Silence. Then, finally, he turned. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something raw, something she wasn't sure he wanted her to see. "Because I know what it's like," he said quietly. Ava frowned. "What?" His jaw tightened, as if he had said too much. But now she couldn't let it go. "You know what it's like?" she repeated. "What does that mean? You're a billionaire. You've never gone hungry a day in your life." Damien's gaze darkened. "Not all hunger is for food." The words sent a shiver down her spine. She didn't know what to say to that, so she didn't say anything. Instead, she shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the door. "Look, I appreciate the food and the bed, but I don't need your pity." His expression remained neutral. "I don't pity you." Ava narrowed her eyes. "Then what is this? Why do you care?" Another silence. Then, finally, he sighed. "I don't know." The honesty in his voice startled her. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. Then, against all logic, she found herself saying, "I'll stay. Just for a little while." Damien gave a small nod, as if he had expected that all along. But neither of them realized just how much that decision would change everything. The days that followed were strange. Ava found herself slipping into a routine she had never known. Waking up in a real bed. Eating meals prepared by an actual chef instead of scavenged from dumpsters. Having clean clothes, warm showers, and a roof over her head without the constant fear of being chased away. But she never let herself get comfortable. She knew this wasn't real. She wasn't one of them. And Damien remained an enigma. Most days, he was busy, caught up in meetings and business calls. But at night, when the city was quiet and the weight of the world seemed lighter, they would sometimes talk. It started small, passing comments, short conversations. But then, one night, as they sat across from each other in the vast living room, the city lights flickering outside, something shifted. "Why do you let people think you're heartless?" Ava asked suddenly. Damien looked up from his glass of whiskey, arching an eyebrow. "Because it's easier." Ava frowned. "Easier than what?" His lips curled into a humorless smirk. "Easier than caring. Easier than trusting the wrong people." She tilted her head. "You don't trust anyone, do you?" His expression remained unreadable. "No." Ava studied him, her stomach twisting. "That must be lonely." Damien's grip on his glass tightened slightly, but he said nothing. Ava hesitated, then spoke before she could stop herself. "I know what that's like," she admitted softly. Damien's gaze flicked to hers, sharp and unreadable. For the first time, she didn't look away. And in that moment, something passed between them. Something unspoken. Something neither of them were ready to name. The media storm hit harder than Ava expected. One morning, she woke up to Damien's staff whispering frantically in hushed voices. Phones buzzed nonstop, and the tension in the penthouse was thick. She didn't understand why, until she saw the headlines. "Mysterious woman seen leaving Damien Cross's penthouse. Who is she?" Billionaire Damien Cross's secret lover? From rags to riches. The homeless girl who stole a billionaire's heart? Ava's stomach dropped. She stormed into Damien's office, where he was leaning against his desk, scrolling through his phone with an expression that could turn steel to ice. "What the hell is this?" she demanded, shoving her phone toward him. He didn't even blink. Exactly what it looks like. Ava's hands clenched into fists. You knew this would happen. His gaze finally lifted to meet hers. I did. Her breath caught. And you didn't think to warn me? He exhaled sharply, setting his phone down. It wouldn't have changed anything. The moment you stepped into my world, this was inevitable. Ava shook her head. I didn't ask for this. I know, Damien said quietly. Her chest ached with frustration. She had spent her whole life invisible. No one had ever cared where she went, what she did, who she was. And now, suddenly, the entire world wanted to dissect her existence. She hated it. And yet, the worst part was that a small, terrifying part of her wasn't sure she wanted to disappear again. Damien studied her carefully. If you want to leave, I'll make it happen. No one will follow you. No one will find you. Ava stared at him, her throat tight. He meant it. He would let her go. No strings. No debts. No expectations. And for some reason, that made it harder. Because as much as she wanted to run, she also wanted to stay. Not for the luxury. Not for the safety. But for him. And that scared her more than anything. The message arrived in the dead of night. A single line, typed in bold, red letters. She's not who you think she is. Damien stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. The anonymous sender had attached a file, encrypted, heavily protected. His instincts screamed at him to delete it, to ignore the faceless accusation. But doubt, that poisonous whisper in the back of his mind, had already crept in. Ava was asleep in the next room, peaceful, trusting, completely unaware of the storm brewing around her. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. Then, against his better judgment, he opened the file. It contained surveillance footage. Damien's breath slowed as he watched the grainy video play. A woman, tall, hooded, moving through a dimly lit alley. The timestamp was from the night of the assassination attempt. The night he had nearly died. Ava's face wasn't visible, but the resemblance was undeniable. His grip tightened around the mouse. It couldn't be her. It didn't make sense. But before he could process it, his phone rang. One of his security team members. Urgent. Sir, we have a situation, the man said, voice clipped and professional. Someone tried to break into the penthouse garage. The suspect got away, but they left something behind. Damien's stomach twisted. What did they leave? A message, the guard said grimly. It was spray-painted on the wall. Damien stepped into the private elevator, his heart pounding harder with each passing floor. When the door slid open, he saw it. Red paint. You should have let her die. The words stretched across the cold, concrete wall like a wound. His enemies hadn't forgotten, and now they were coming for Ava. Ava felt it before she saw it. The way the air in the penthouse had changed. The way Damien's gaze lingered too long when he looked at her, his eyes sharp, calculating. The way his staff, who had never fully accepted her, now whispered behind her back more than ever. She knew something was wrong. She just didn't know what. But when she stepped into the living room that morning, she found Damien already waiting. He stood by the window, his posture stiff, his expression unreadable. We need to talk, he said. Ava's stomach clenched. Okay, she said carefully. What's going on? He turned, crossing his arms. Where were you the night I was attacked? The question hit like a slap. She blinked. What? His voice was colder now. Where were you? Ava swallowed hard. I told you. I was nearby, looking for food, and He tossed something onto the table between them. A printed image. Blurry, but unmistakable. The figure in the alley. The timestamp. Her pulse stuttered. You think that's me? She whispered. Damien didn't answer. Ava's heart pounded. I don't know where that came from, but I wasn't there. I saved your life. Why would I? That's what I'm trying to figure out. He cut in, voice razor sharp. Were you working with him all along? Pain flared through her chest. You don't believe that. He didn't say he did, but he also didn't say he didn't. Ava stepped forward, her hands trembling. Damien, please. You know me. You know I wouldn't. His jaw tightened. I don't know anything anymore. The words shattered something inside her. She sucked in a sharp breath, her vision blurring. After everything. After all the nights spent talking, breaking down walls. After all the times she had let herself believe, just for a second, that maybe she wasn't alone anymore. He still didn't trust her. Ava let out a shaky laugh, though there was no humor in it. I should have known, she whispered. I should have known this was temporary. That no matter what, I'd always be disposable to you. Damien's face darkened. You're not. Then why are you doing this? She choked out. Why are you looking at me like I'm the enemy? His silence was the answer. Ava felt something inside her crack. She wiped at her eyes, forcing herself to straighten. Fine, she said. If you think I betrayed you, then let's make this easy. She turned for the door. Damien didn't stop her. He just watched as she walked away. And when the door slammed behind her, the weight of his own silence crushed him. The cold air outside hit Ava like a slap, but she barely felt it. She walked without direction, without purpose, just moving forward because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant feeling. Her mind screamed at her to turn back, to fight, to make him see the truth. But what was the point? Damien had already made his choice. She had been a fool to believe this was anything more than a temporary arrangement. A car sped past, spraying icy rainwater on her jeans, but she didn't react. Her body ached with exhaustion, but she didn't stop. She just kept moving back into the life she had known before him. Back to nothing. The one person I never questioned, Damien said bitterly. He planted the evidence against you, manipulated everything. He made sure I saw exactly what he wanted me to see. His voice turned rough, and I let him. Ava's stomach twisted. But why? Money. Power. He was working with my enemies from the inside, feeding them information. And when I got too close to exposing them, they made a move. Damien's jaw tightened. They tried to kill me. And when that failed, they made sure I turned on the one person who could have saved me. Ava's hands curled into fists. You should have listened to me. I know. Damien's voice was raw, filled with something unfamiliar. Regret. Ava swallowed hard. She wanted to be angry. She was angry. But beneath all of it, there was something else. Something far more dangerous. A small, broken part of her wanted to believe him. She shook her head. What happens now? Christopher's gone, Damien said, his voice edged with steel. He won't be able to hurt anyone again. Ava didn't ask what that meant. But my enemies, Damien leaned back, his eyes unreadable. They won't stop. And now that they know I've found the truth, they'll come after you, too. A chill ran down her spine. He wasn't wrong. Damien rubbed a hand over his face. That's why I brought you here. She narrowed her eyes. To keep me locked away. To keep you safe. Ava let out a slow breath. I don't need you to protect me. His gaze darkened. You almost died out there, Ava. Her heart pounded. Because of you. Silence. Damien didn't deny it. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. The weight of everything unsaid hung between them. Finally, Ava let out a quiet sigh. I don't know how to forgive you. Damien's expression softened. I don't expect you to. Ava closed her eyes. She was exhausted. Physically, mentally, emotionally. But there was one thing she knew for sure. She wasn't running this time, and neither was he. The following days passed in an uneasy silence. Damien gave Ava space. He didn't push, didn't demand anything from her, and that, more than anything, unsettled her. She had expected him to try to control the situation, to force her into some kind of arrangement where he could keep an eye on her. But instead, he gave her choices. She could leave if she wanted to. No guards, no locked doors, just freedom. And yet, she hadn't walked out. Not yet. Ava stood on the balcony of Damien's private estate, the cold wind tangling her hair. The view stretched for miles. Endless greenery, the distant city skyline barely visible through the haze. It was beautiful, and so incredibly far from the life she had always known. You should eat something. Ava jumped slightly, turned to find Damien standing in the doorway. He wasn't dressed in his usual expensive suits. Just a sweater, dark pants, his hair slightly tousled. He looked normal. She crossed her arms. I'm not hungry. Damien studied her for a long moment, then sighed. Come inside. It's freezing out here. Ava hesitated, but eventually she followed. The estate was eerily quiet, only the distant sound of the fireplace crackling in the background. Damien walked ahead of her, leading her to the dining room. To her surprise, there was no elaborate feast, no grand display of wealth. Just a bowl of warm soup. He pulled out a chair for her. Sit. She gave him a wary look, but eventually lowered herself into the seat. Damien sat across from her. He didn't speak. Didn't try to fill the silence with unnecessary words. He just waited. Ava stared at the bowl in front of her. The steam curled into the air, carrying the scent of something familiar. Chicken soup. Simple. Warm. Something she hadn't had in years. Her throat tightened as she picked up the spoon. The first taste burned her tongue, but she barely noticed. It was good. Better than it had any right to be. She didn't realize she was trembling until she set the spoon down. Damien was watching her. Not with pity. Not with expectation. Just quiet patience. Ava swallowed hard. Why are you doing this? His expression didn't change. Because I don't want to lose you again. Her fingers curled around the edge of the table. She wanted to believe him. But trust wasn't something that came easily. Not anymore. Still, she took another bite. And for the first time in weeks, she felt something close to warmth. That night, Ava couldn't sleep. She wandered the halls of the estate, her mind restless. When she reached the study, she hesitated. The door was slightly open. Light spilled into the hallway. Curiosity won out. She stepped inside. Damien was at his desk, flipping through papers, his expression tense. You don't sleep much, do you? Ava said quietly. Damien didn't look up. Not lately. Ava hesitated before stepping closer. The documents in front of him weren't business contracts. They were security reports. Maps. Plans. He was still hunting them. The people who had framed her. Who had tried to kill him. He wasn't done. Ava's pulse quickened. She had spent so long running, so long trying to survive. But for the first time, she wasn't alone. Damien finally looked up. Can't sleep? Ava exhaled. No. A beat of silence. Then, you can stay, he said. As long as you want. Ava held his gaze. And for the first time, she believed him. The night air was thick with tension as Damien's car pulled up in front of the rundown motel. The neon sign flickered weakly, casting a dull red glow onto the wet pavement. He stepped out, his heart pounding in his chest. The past weeks had been spent in a desperate search, chasing empty leads, drowning in guilt. But this time, he knew Ava was here. His men had traced her movements, following scattered reports of a woman matching her description. Each clue had brought him closer, each passing day deepening his regret. And now, standing before this worn-down building, he was terrified. Terrified of what he might find. He pushed open the door to the motel lobby, barely acknowledging the disinterested clerk behind the desk. The man barely looked up, chewing on a toothpick as he slid Damien a key. Room 214. Damien took the stairs two at a time, gripping the key so tightly it dug into his palm. His mind swirled with possibilities. Was she angry? Would she even listen? Would she slam the door in his face? But nothing could have prepared him for what he saw when he stepped inside. Ava sat on the edge of the bed, wrapped in a thin blanket. The room was freezing, the small heater barely functioning. Her skin was pale, her lips chapped, dark circles under her eyes. She looked fragile, so unlike the fierce, stubborn woman he had known. She turned her head slightly at the sound of the door opening, but there was no real recognition in her gaze. Fever glazed her eyes, making her unfocused. Damien's throat tightened. He had done this to her. He had cast her out, forced her back into a world that had never been kind to her. And now she was barely holding on. Ava, he whispered, stepping closer. She blinked slowly, her breath shallow. Damien. Her voice was weak, barely audible. He swallowed hard, kneeling in front of her. I'm here. She flinched slightly at his closeness, her body tense. Even in this state, she was still wary of him. You shouldn't be, she murmured. Damien ignored the stab of pain that her words brought. I had to find you. Ava let out a quiet, bitter laugh. Took you long enough. Guilt crashed over him. He reached out, but she tensed, and he pulled his hand back. You're sick, he said instead. You need a doctor. I'll be fine. He exhaled sharply. No, you won't. Her stubbornness, even now, was both frustrating and heartbreaking. You don't have to do this, she said after a long pause. Damien clenched his jaw. Yes, I do. Ava looked away. Why? Because you feel guilty? He didn't answer right away. The truth was, guilt was only part of it. The bigger part, the part he couldn't say out loud yet, was that he couldn't lose her again. But she wasn't ready to hear that. So instead, he said, "I made a mistake." Ava let out a slow breath. "Yeah, you did. I should have believed you." His voice was raw. "I should have protected you." She stared at the floor, her fingers tightening around the blanket. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he continued, his voice quieter now. I need you to let me fix this." Ava finally looked at him, and for the first time he saw it. Not just the pain, not just the exhaustion, but the tiniest flicker of something else. Hope. It was faint, barely there, but it was enough. "Let me take you home," he said. Ava hesitated. Then, finally, she nodded. The ride back to Damien's penthouse was silent. Ava sat curled against the window, her frail body barely holding up. Damien stole glances at her, guilt gnawing at him. How had he let it come to this? How had he doubted her? When they arrived, the staff was already prepared. A private doctor examined Ava, confirming what Damien already feared. She was dangerously weak. Dehydration, malnutrition, and the fever had taken a toll on her. She needed rest. But Damien knew rest alone wouldn't heal the wounds he had left. For days, he stayed close, watching over her. He made sure she had everything: food, warmth, security. But Ava barely spoke. When she was awake, she stared out the window, lost in thought. When she slept, her body curled up as if she were still on the streets, protecting herself from a world that had never been kind. Damien hated it. He hated that he had become one more person who had hurt her. So he did the one thing he had never done before. He swallowed his pride. One evening, he sat beside her, his voice quiet. "I don't deserve your forgiveness." Ava didn't respond, but he knew she was listening. "I don't expect you to trust me again," he continued. "But I need you to know I was wrong. I let my fears, my past, cloud my judgment. And I hurt you." Ava turned her head slightly, her eyes unreadable. "You were the only person who ever helped me without expecting anything in return," he admitted. "And I threw that away." She exhaled slowly. "Yes, you did." A long silence stretched between them. Then finally, "But you found me," she whispered. "Hope." It was there again, flickering in her tired eyes. And Damien clung to it. Days passed, and Ava grew stronger. She still kept her distance, but something had shifted. She let him sit with her, let him speak. Slowly, the walls began to crack. And then Damien did something no one ever expected. He went public. In a televised statement, he exposed the truth, the betrayal, the lies, the evidence that had framed Ava. He made it clear that she had been innocent all along, that he had been a fool to doubt her. The world was stunned. But Damien didn't care about the world. He only cared about her. Ava watched the broadcast, her expression unreadable. When it ended, she turned to Damien. "Why?" she asked. "Because you deserve the truth," he said simply. Ava studied him for a long moment. "And what if I walk away?" His jaw tightened. "Then I'll let you." She nodded, as if testing his words. Then, after a pause, "I'm not ready to forgive you. I know, but I want to try." And for the first time in weeks, Damien allowed himself to breathe. The days that followed were different. Ava didn't just exist in the penthouse. She lived in it. She laughed. She argued with him. She slowly let him back in. Their past wasn't erased, but together they began to build something new. And one night, as they stood on the balcony, the city lights stretching below them, Ava turned to him. "You really love me, don't you?" Damien's chest tightened. "Yes." Ava smiled just a little. "Then I guess it's my turn to trust you." And in that moment, he knew he would spend the rest of his life proving her right.